During a live broadcast charity event, a millionaire businessman was brutally kidnapped by masked men in front of hundreds of shocked spectators. After 8 hours of desperate but fruitless searches, a 17-year-old girl surviving on the streets tugged fearfully at a police officer's sleeve. "I know where he is. Please, listen to me." Initially dismissed as just a beggar, she finally convinced the skeptical officers to follow her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. When they forced open a container locked with heavy padlocks, the police fell into total despair as they uncovered something that made them immediately call for every reinforcement available. The glare of the lights was blinding, reflecting off crystal flutes and jewels worth more than Lena would ever see in her entire life. At 17, she was a shadow on the periphery of this opulent universe, huddled near a service exit of the grand ballroom. The cold night air was sliced by the warmth emanating from the open doors, carrying with it the smell of rich food and expensive perfume, a delicious torture for her empty stomach. She wasn't there to steal, only to feel, for a moment, what it was like to belong to a world where cold and hunger weren't constant companions. The philanthropic event, broadcast live across the country, celebrated the generosity of one man, Arthur Drummond. His face, kind and marked with smile lines, filled the enormous screens scattered throughout the venue. A billionaire whose fortune seemed inexhaustible, yet who dedicated a large part of his capital to noble causes, like building children's hospitals. Lena admired him from afar, a beacon of kindness in an ocean of indifference. As the master of ceremonies announced Arthur's name with great pomp, a murmur of applause and admiration rippled through the crowd. People rose to their feet, turning their faces to the stage, where the tycoon ascended the steps with a steady gait and a modest wave. Lena, from her observation post, felt a pang of hope. People like him made the world seem a little less bleak. He was proof that wealth could serve a higher purpose, that the accumulation of assets didn't have to be an end in itself. For her, who measured her own existence in counted coins for a loaf of bread, Arthur's net worth was a fantasy, a fairy tale of successful investments and business deals that transformed into saved lives. He approached the microphone, his lips curving into a warm smile that the cameras captured in close-up. An expectant silence fell over the hall. It was in that exact instant that the fairy tale shattered. The sharp squeal of tires on asphalt tore through the night, overpowering the soft melody playing in the background. A black, windowless van with its headlights off emerged from the darkness of the side street, stopping abruptly just feet from the main entrance. The side doors slid open with a metallic crash, and before security could react, 4 masked figures leaped out. They moved with a frightening precision, a choreography of violence that paralyzed everyone. The once vibrant crowd became a collective statue of shock. Muffled screams and gasps of panic were the only sounds that broke the stunned silence. The men stormed the stage with breathtaking speed. 2 of them seized Arthur Drummond by the arms, his expression of surprise twisting into a mask of restrained resistance. He didn't scream, didn't struggle flamboyantly. He just stiffened, the dignity in his eyes defying the terror of the situation. Lena watched it all, petrified. Fear, an old acquaintance, wrapped around her like an icy cloak. Her first instinct, forged in years of survival on the streets, was to run, to disappear, to become invisible. But her feet seemed nailed to the floor. She saw them gag the businessman and drag him outside, his body vanishing into the darkness of the van. The doors slammed shut with a final thud, and the vehicle sped off, leaving behind a vacuum of chaos, screams and flashing lights. The world seemed to have tilted on its axis. As panic finally exploded in the ballroom, Lena remained motionless, her heart pounding uncontrollably. She had seen something that the others, in their shock and confusion, probably hadn't noticed. A small detail, a discreet symbol on the side of the van, almost hidden by grime. A detail that burned itself into her mind with the terrifying clarity of a photograph. The secret of what she had just witnessed was now a weight on her chest. A smoldering ember that could either incinerate her fragile life or, perhaps, be the only spark of hope for that good man. The chaos set in like a sudden storm. Sharp screams echoed through the hall, mixing with the shrill sound of approaching sirens. Lena retreated into the darkness of the alley, her body trembling uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the pure terror she had witnessed. Her survival instinct, honed by years of forced invisibility, screamed at her to run, to blend into the shadows and forget everything. Talking to the police was like inviting a wolf into her den. To the world, she was a problem to be ignored. To the authorities, she was a potential suspect, an inconvenient piece out of place. The symbol she'd seen on the van, a strange serpent biting its own tail, burned in her memory. It was dangerous knowledge, a burden she hadn't asked for, and certainly didn't want to carry. She huddled behind a dumpster, its sour smell enveloping her, as the red and blue lights of the cruisers painted the alley with intermittent flashes of panic. Police officers spilled out of their cars, weapons drawn, their firm, authoritative voices cutting through the confusion. The next few hours dragged on in a haze of fear and uncertainty. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. Helicopters sliced through the night sky, their searchlights sweeping the streets like giant inquisitive eyes. From her hiding place, Lena heard snippets of conversation, the buzz of news crews that had arrived in droves. The words floated in the air: billionaire, kidnapping, incalculable fortune. They speculated on the motives: a ransom demand for his vast assets, a business vendetta, a dispute over an old inheritance. Every word tightened the knot in her stomach. She was the only one who held a real clue, a single loose thread in the crime's perfect fabric. But to give them that information meant exposing herself, becoming visible to people who wouldn't hesitate to silence her. Anonymity was her only armor on the streets, and she was about to cast it aside. The sun began to rise, painting the sky a melancholic gray. 8 hours had passed, 8 hours of fruitless searches, of dead ends, of an entire city mobilized to no avail. Lena felt hunger gnawing at her insides, but it was the hunger for justice that ached more. She closed her eyes, and the image of Arthur Drummond on the stage returned with full force. It wasn't the billionaire she saw, not the man whose stock market shares were worth more than small countries. It was the grandfather with the kind smile, the man who wanted to build hospitals so that children like her, one day, wouldn't have to suffer alone. A fleeting memory of her own childhood, of a high fever and the helplessness of having nowhere to go, hit her like a punch. That man used his money to create havens, and now he was in a dark captivity, maybe hurt, maybe terrified. Compassion, an emotion she often had to stifle to survive, bloomed in her chest, stubborn and unyielding. The fear was still there, a cold creature on her spine, but the image of Arthur's face was stronger. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Inaction would be a betrayal of herself, of the small spark of hope that man represented. Making a decision that could seal her fate, she stood up, her legs stiff and sore. She straightened her worn clothes and stepped out of the alley, blinking against the faint morning light. The commotion in front of the ballroom had subsided, leaving only a few police cars and officers with tired, frustrated expressions. They looked defeated, turning over the same useless clues. Lena took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs and giving her a fragile courage. She walked along the sidewalk, keeping to the edge, still a shadow. Her eyes scanned the officers, searching for a face that wasn't so hard, someone who might actually listen. She found one, leaning against his cruiser, rubbing his eyes with exhaustion. He looked more human, less like an impersonal cog in the machine of the law. It was now or never. With her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, She crossed the street, each step an act of rebellion against years of self-preservation instinct. She approached from behind, her hand trembling, and reached out to touch his arm. The sleeve of his uniform was rough beneath her fingertips. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a choked sob escaped. The officer turned, the startle in his eyes quickly turning to impatience as he saw the frail, ragged figure before him. The officer, a middle-aged man with weariness etched in the lines around his eyes, looked down at Lena with an expression she knew all too well, a mix of pity and annoyance. It was the look she got every day, the look that reduced her to a problem, a nuisance. "What do you want, kid? Can't you see we're busy?" he asked, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night, her words tangled in her throat, choked by urgency and the fear of being dismissed. I know," she stammered, the sound barely audible. "I know where he is." The tears she'd held back for hours finally began to fall, tracing dirty paths down her face. She pulled on his uniform sleeve with more force, a desperate gesture to be taken seriously. The officer frowned, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe. To him, she was just another homeless kid, maybe unstable, looking for attention or trying to profit from the situation. The city was full of people like her, with fantastic stories and conspiracy theories. Who is?" he asked, skepticism clear in his tone, already preparing to send her on her way and get back to real work. "The man, Mr. Drummond," Lena whispered, her voice cracking. "I saw it. I saw the van." The officer let out a heavy sigh, the kind that said he didn't have time for this. "Listen, kid, everyone saw the van. The whole city's looking for it. Unless you've got a license plate or the exact direction they went, you're not helping." He tried to pull away from her grasp, but Lena clung to him, panic giving her unexpected strength. "No, you don't understand," she nearly shouted. Drawing the gaze of another officer nearby, "I saw a symbol on the side, a snake eating its own tail. I know where it is. It's an old warehouse down by the tracks. They use that place for things." The memory of hiding there herself a few times, escaping a heavy rain or some nighttime danger, gave her certainty. It was a place forgotten by everyone, the perfect hideout. The officer eyed her suspiciously. It was too specific to be a complete fabrication. But the source was so unlikely his mind refused to accept it. "An abandoned warehouse. How do you know that?" he questioned, crossing his arms. His partner walked over, curious. "What's the problem, Marcus?" The first officer, Marcus, shook his head. "Nothing, just another street kid making up stories for attention. Thinks she knows where Drummond is." The second officer laughed without humor. "Oh, sure. And I know where there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Come on, kid, move along. We don't have time for games." The phrase "street kid" hit her like a slap. She wasn't a thing, she was a person who was trying to help. The frustration and injustice of it all made her cry harder. "It's not a lie, please, you have to believe me. He's there, I'm sure of it. Please," she begged, her voice breaking with desperation. She looked from one skeptical face to the other, seeing only closed doors. Time was running out. Every minute they spent here, doubting her, was a minute less for Arthur Drummond. The image of his kind face, now perhaps marked by fear, spurred her on. She had to make them listen. Taking a shaky breath, she tried to control her sobs and looked Marcus straight in the eye. "Look, I have nothing. I don't want money. I don't want anything from you. That man, he helps kids. I've needed help before. If you don't go, it could be too late. What do you lose by checking it out? 10 minutes. What if I'm right?" The simple, direct logic of her argument seemed to shake their armor of cynicism. Marcus exchanged an uncertain look with his partner. It was true. The investigation was at a dead end. They had scoured the city based on far less concrete information. What would it cost to follow up on a desperate kid's tip? Worst case, they'd waste a few minutes. Best case, they'd solve the biggest case of the year. Marcus studied Lena's face for a long moment. There was a terrified sincerity in her eyes that was hard to dismiss. It wasn't the cunning of a grifter, but the genuine panic of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "All right," he finally relented, grudgingly. "All right, kid, you ride with us. But if this is a waste of time, you'll have some explaining to do to the captain." He opened the back door of the squad car. The gesture was more of an order than an invitation. Lena felt a chill as she got in, the smell of disinfectant and the hard plastic of the seat making her feel like a prisoner. But at the same time, a wave of relief washed over her. They had listened. They were going. As the car pulled away, sirens off so as not to draw attention. She pointed with a trembling finger toward the city's industrial suburbs. "It's that way," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Near the old train line, the car accelerated, and Lena felt there was no turning back. She had crossed an invisible line, stepping out of the shadows and directly into the blinding light of danger. The drive to the city's industrial zone was tense and silent. Lena sat huddled in the back seat, her hands clasped in her lap to stop them from shaking. The two officers in the front exchanged occasional glances in the rearview mirror, their expressions still heavy with doubt. For them, this was a long shot, a last-ditch effort before admitting they had nothing. For Lena, every block they passed tightened the pressure in her chest. What if she was wrong? What if her memory had played a trick on her, if the symbol was just a coincidence? The weight of responsibility was crushing. The life of a man, a billionaire whose existence was a universe away from hers, depended on the credibility of a girl the world tried its best not to see. They arrived in a desolate area, where the skeletons of rusted factories rose against the grey sky, the train tracks, overgrown with weeds, cut through the landscape like an old scar. "This is it," Lena whispered, pointing to a row of identical warehouses with corrugated metal walls and steel doors. "It's that one, the last one." Officer Marcus stopped the cruiser a safe distance away, killing the engine. The ensuing silence was profound, broken only by the whistle of the wind through the abandoned structures. "You sure, kid?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Lena just nodded, unable to speak. The place oozed an air of neglect and menace. The officers drew their weapons, the metallic click of the holsters echoing inside the car. "Stay here and don't get out for any reason," Marcus ordered, before he and his partner exited, moving cautiously toward the indicated warehouse. Lena watched through the window, her heart in her throat. She saw them approach the large metal door, examining it. They communicated on their radios, quietly calling for backup. The wait was the longest of Lena's life. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, more squad cars arrived, silent as predators. A tactical team formed, men dressed in black, moving with a trained efficiency that contrasted with the decaying scenery. Lena saw them position themselves around the warehouse. The tension was palpable, an electric energy in the air. Then, with a bang that made her jump in her seat, they breached the main door. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence returned, heavier and more threatening than before. Lena held her breath, her eyes fixed on the dark entrance of the building. Officers moved inside, disappearing into the blackness. Minutes later, one of them came out and gave a hand signal. It didn't look like anyone was inside. Lena's stomach turned. She was wrong. She had imagined it all. The humiliation and the fear of what they would do to her washed over her. But then, the search continued. They weren't looking for people, but for something. That's when she saw one of the officers pointing to a dark corner of the vast warehouse. There, almost hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a metal shipping container. It was grey and anonymous, except for the multiple heavy padlocks securing its doors. The officers approached the container with renewed caution. Lena, disobeying the order to stay in the car, opened the door and slipped out, keeping a safe distance, but needing to see. Officer Marcus saw her, but was too preoccupied to reprimand her. A member of the tactical team brought a hydraulic bolt cutter, a powerful tool that looked like a toy in the muscular officer's hands. The sound of shearing metal echoed through the warehouse as 1, 2, 3, 4 padlocks gave way with sharp cracks. The team readied themselves, weapons aimed, as 2 officers heaved the heavy container doors open. They groaned, swinging wide to reveal the darkness within. For an instant, everyone hesitated. Then they switched on their flashlights, and the beams of light cut through the gloom, falling on a scene that made Lena's blood run cold. Arthur Drummond was there, sitting on the cold floor, his back against the metal wall. He was bound with thick ropes, his wrists and ankles tied, and silver duct tape covered his mouth, silencing any sound. His eyes, however, were open, wide with terror and relief. But that wasn't what made everyone's heart stop. Next to him, fixed to the wall, was an electronic device. A red digital screen glowed in the dark, displaying a countdown. The numbers pulsed with a deadly urgency. 0009:0. 9 minutes. Time was running out, and the sound of the digital ticking seemed to fill the entire world. The shout from one of the officers shattered the stunned silence. "Bomb! We've got a bomb!" The phrase reverberated off the metal walls of the warehouse, transforming the rescue scene into a nightmare of urgency. Panic was an invisible wave, but the trained men of the tactical team contained it with discipline. "Everyone back! Secure the perimeter! Get the bomb squad on the line, now!" The orders were barked in quick, sharp tones, an attempt to impose order on the impending chaos. 2 officers rushed into the container, not to disarm the device, but to try and free Arthur Drummond. Their gloved hands worked frantically at the tight knots of the ropes. The tycoon, his eyes fixed on the timer, made muffled, desperate sounds from behind the gag. The time on the digital display seemed to accelerate, each second falling like a grain of sand in an hourglass about to empty. 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Lena watched from a distance, her hands covering her mouth in horror. The joy of having found him was instantly replaced by an icy terror. She hadn't saved him, she had merely led them all to the brink of a catastrophe. The officers managed to cut the ropes binding Arthur's arms and legs. Carefully, they peeled the duct tape from his mouth. He gasped, coughing as fresh air rushed into his lungs. "The device," he managed to say, his voice hoarse from disuse and fear. "They said, it's wired to me. If I move away, it detonates." The revelation landed like a bomb, as potent as the one threatening to explode. The officers froze. The simple rescue of dragging him out was off the table. He was the anchor of his own death trap. 7 minutes. The sirens of the bomb squad wailed in the distance, a high-pitched lament approaching with torturous slowness. Outside the warehouse, the area was being evacuated. Reporters and onlookers were pushed back behind an ever-widening line of yellow tape. The story, already sensational, was about to reach a deadly climax, and everyone wanted to watch. Lena remained where she was, forgotten in the confusion, an invisible spectator to the drama she had started. She could see Arthur Drummond's face, illuminated by the cold light of the flashlights. There was fear, yes, but also a strange calm. The resignation of a man who had lived a full life and now faced its possible end with unshakable dignity. His gaze met Lena's for a brief second across the crowd of uniforms. There was a recognition there, a silent question, and Lena, helpless, could only return a look of pure dread. 6 minutes. The bomb squad finally arrived. 2 technicians, wearing heavy suits that made them look like astronauts on a perilous mission, entered the warehouse carrying a case of equipment. They approached the container with a professional calm that seemed superhuman. One knelt beside Arthur, examining the device, while the other opened the case, revealing a tangle of wires, pliers, and meters. "It's complex," the first technician said, his voice muffled by his helmet. "Not an amateur job. It's got multiple triggers, a proximity sensor, a timer, and probably a remote detonator. He pointed to a small infrared sensor on the device aimed at Arthur's chest. The tycoon was right. If he moves more than 3 feet away, the pressure changes and this whole place goes up. The analysis only heightened the tension. It wasn't just a race against time, but a deadly puzzle with multiple traps. The technicians began their work, communicating in their own language of technical terms and codes. Cut the blue wire. No. Wait. Check the voltage on the secondary circuit first. 5 minutes. Arthur Drummond closed his eyes, breathing deeply, as if preparing for the inevitable. The officers who had freed him remained by his side, a silent act of solidarity and courage. They would not leave him alone. Lena felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of helplessness. She had done the right thing, but the right thing had led to a scene of horror. She thought of her own life, of all the times she had narrowly escaped danger, of all the mornings she had woken up grateful just to be alive. Now she was watching a good man, a man who used his immense wealth for good, trapped in a countdown to oblivion. The injustice of it was an open wound. 4 minutes. Sweat beaded on the brow of the technician working on the wires. His hands, despite the pressure, were steady. He whispered instructions to his partner, who monitored the readings on a small oscilloscope. The fate of everyone in that warehouse, the life of Arthur Drummond, the outcome of a manhunt that had brought the city to a standstill. It all came down to those colored wires and making the right choice. The digital ticking continued, relentless, each pulse a step closer to the end. 3 minutes. The air inside the warehouse felt so thick it was hard to breathe. Every person present was a statue of tension, their eyes fixed on the delicate, deadly dance of the technician's hands over the tangle of wires. The sound of the wire cutters, an almost inaudible click, was amplified by the silence, echoing like a gunshot. A red wire was severed. The timer didn't stop. A collective sigh of relief and continued anxiety rippled through the small group. That disabled the remote trigger, the technician said, his voice steady but with a note of strained effort. But the proximity sensor and the timer are still active, and they seem to be linked. Disarming one might accelerate the other. The complexity of the trap was diabolical. The kidnappers hadn't just wanted a ransom, they wanted to ensure destruction, to create a spectacle of terror. The mind behind this was cruel and methodical. 2 minutes. Arthur Drummond, who had maintained a remarkable composure, began to show signs of the extreme pressure. A bead of sweat trickled from his temple, tracing a slow path down his cheek. His eyes, however, were no longer on the timer. They were fixed on the men working to save him, an expression of gratitude and concern for them. He understood that these people were risking their lives for his. The irony did not escape him. He, a man whose net worth was measured in billions, whose life was filled with the luxury and security money could buy, was now completely dependent on the courage of strangers. His assets, his stocks, his entire financial empire were useless against this pulsing box of metal and circuits. His life, in that moment, was worth exactly as much as anyone else's. 90 seconds. "The main power source is shielded," announced the second technician, who was analyzing a diagram on a tablet. "We can't just cut it. We have to bypass the flow to a dummy circuit without the system detecting the voltage drop. We have to bridge it in under a microsecond." It was a procedure of surgical precision to be performed under the imminent threat of annihilation. Lena, from her observation post, felt her own body vibrating with the tension. She willed, she prayed, she sent every bit of positive energy she could muster toward those gloved hands. She felt connected to this man in a way she couldn't explain. Saving Arthur Drummond had become, for her, a way of saving herself, of proving that one act of courage, even from someone as insignificant as her, could make a difference in the world. 60 seconds. The final minute. The ticking of the timer sounded like time itself coming apart. The lead technician picked up 2 thin clamps, each holding the end of a bypass wire. "Ready?" he asked his partner. "Ready." The world seemed to shrink, focusing on that single point. The technician's hands moved with a speed and precision that were almost a blur. The clamps touched the contacts, a fluid, exact motion. For one terrifying second, the red light of the numbers on the screen flickered. Everyone's heart stopped. Then the light stabilized again. The timer continued its inexorable march. Bridge established. Power is being diverted. Now the timer. It's a code loop. "I have to manually interrupt it at the exact point," the technician said, his voice breathless. He pried open a small panel on the side of the device, revealing an intricate circuit board. 30 seconds. He used a thin probe to touch one of the solder points on the board. The countdown continued. 20 seconds. He tried another point. Nothing. The frustration was visible in his posture, a slight tremor in his shoulders. "It's not working. The code is protecting itself." 10 seconds. Desperation began to creep in. The officers beside Arthur instinctively shielded him with their bodies, a futile but profoundly human act. 9, 8, 7. It was then that Arthur, who had been watching the technician with a feverish intensity, spoke. "Try the chip under the display. I saw one of them solder something there when they set it." 6, 5. The technician didn't hesitate. With a swift movement, he used a small pry tool to lift the edge of the digital screen. Underneath was a small chip that wasn't on the diagram. 4, 3. He jammed the probe there and pressed down hard. 2. The screen flickered violently, and then, with a final pulse of red light, it went dark. The ticking stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Lena had ever heard. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The world was suspended. Then, the technician slowly stood up and said the words everyone had been waiting to hear. "It's disarmed." The sigh of relief was a hurricane, a wave of life that swept through the warehouse, carrying the specter of death with it. Arthur Drummond, saved at the very last second, collapsed forward, his strength finally deserting him, and was caught by the officers. His eyes, filled with tears, found Lena's again, and this time he smiled. The wave of relief was overwhelming, but the calm was short-lived. As soon as the news that the danger had passed spread, the warehouse turned into a hub of frantic activity. Paramedics rushed to attend to Arthur Drummond, who, though physically unharmed, was clearly in a state of shock. Police and detectives began to cordon off the container, treating it as a complex crime scene, searching for the smallest clue the kidnappers might have left behind. The television cameras, now allowed to approach, broadcast the live image of the tycoon being placed on a stretcher, a silver thermal blanket over his shoulders. Amid the commotion, Lena became the center of unexpected attention. Officer Marcus pulled her aside, his expression of skepticism now completely replaced by dumbfounded respect. "Kid, you saved his life. How did you know? How did you know about this place?" The questions were many, and Lena, overwhelmed and exhausted, could barely form a coherent answer. She just mumbled something about the symbol on the van and having hidden there before. Arthur, before being taken to the ambulance, insisted on speaking with her. He sat up on the stretcher, the fragility of the moment contrasting with the image of power the public had of him. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice still weak but filled with genuine emotion. "Lena," she replied shyly. He reached out his hand, and when Lena hesitantly placed hers in his, he held it with surprising strength. "Lena, I owe you my life. I will never forget this. I will find you. I will make sure you're safe. You have my word." The promise was a beacon of hope in an ocean of uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, Lena felt that the future might be different. The idea of a safe place, of no longer having to worry about her next meal or a roof over her head, was a dream almost painful in its beauty. She watched the ambulance depart, carrying with it the man whose life had become so dramatically intertwined with hers. In the days that followed, Lena's story became a sensation. The media dubbed her the Angel of the Streets. Cameras followed her, reporters tried to interview her, but the police kept her in protective custody at a temporary shelter while the investigation proceeded. It was a strange, uncomfortable world. People who once ignored her now wanted to hear her story. Arthur Drummond's promise echoed in her mind, a mantra of hope. True to his word, he sent lawyers and social workers to speak with her, beginning the process of offering her a new life, a home, an education, security. Everything she had ever wanted was within her grasp. However, a shadow of unease hung over her. The kidnappers were still at large. The same people who built that deadly trap now knew it was her, an anonymous girl from the streets who had foiled their plans. And that's when the first significant obstacle appeared, subtle but terrifying. One night at the shelter, another of the youths approached her, his face pale. "Lena, there was a man outside, asking for you. He didn't look like a cop or a reporter." The description of the man, tall, with a scar over his eyebrow, meant nothing to her, but the shiver that ran down her spine was an instinctive warning. The police stepped up security, but Lena knew the truth. The streets had eyes and ears everywhere. Her old hiding spots, the alleys and awnings that were once her refuge, were now dangerous territories. She was marked. The anonymity that had protected her for so long had shattered, and she was exposed, vulnerable. The fame that celebrated her as a hero also painted her as a target. The criminals, watching from the shadows, knew exactly who to look for. The billionaire's gratitude, instead of being her immediate salvation, was a spotlight that made her easier to find. The real turning point, where the course of the story shifted in an unexpected and terrible way, came a week after the rescue. Lena was in a secure room, giving her official statement to two detectives. She was describing the snake symbol again, the layout of the warehouse, every detail she could remember. One detective was taking notes, while the other watched her with an intensity that made her nervous. He picked up a tablet and began swiping through photos, archival images from old cases, and symbols of known organizations. "Did it look like any of these?" he asked. Lena looked one by one, and then she froze. There it was, the snake eating its own tail. But it wasn't on the side of a van in a criminal file. It was engraved on a signet ring, in an old black and white photograph, a family photo. "That's it," she whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. The detective zoomed in on the image. It was a formal portrait of a group of wealthy, aristocratic-looking people posing in front of a mansion. At the center of the photo, a younger man was wearing the ring. The detective looked at his partner, his expression grim. Run facial recognition on the young man in the photo, Drummond Family Archives. Lena felt the floor disappear from under her. The symbol didn't belong to a street gang. It was a family crest, the family crest of Arthur Drummond. Lena's world tilted again, but this time the vertigo was deeper, more disorienting. The photograph on the detective's tablet was a portal to a reality she couldn't comprehend. The symbol that had haunted her for a week, the mark of terrifying anonymous criminals, belonged to the very family of the man they had tried to annihilate. The betrayal was of a magnitude her simple mind, accustomed to direct and brutal dangers, struggled to process. The detectives exchanged a look that said it all. This was no longer a kidnapping for money. It was an internal war, a feud over inheritance and power waged in the shadows of one of the country's wealthiest families. That doesn't make sense, Lena whispered, more to herself than to the men in the room. Why would they do that to him? The older detective shut off the tablet with a weary gesture. Fortune, kid. The greed for a great fortune makes people do unimaginable things. Mr. Drummond's net worth is big enough to create monsters, even inside his own home. The news was brought to Arthur Drummond in his private hospital room, a sanctuary of luxury and sterility. He was recovering well. The initial shock giving way to immense gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose. He was already planning how to use part of his capital to create a foundation for young people like Lena. When the detectives showed him the photo, his face, which had been regaining its color, turned a waxy pale. He recognized the young man in the portrait instantly, his nephew, Richard, his late brother's son, a young man he had helped raise, whom he had trusted, to whom he had offered a place in his businesses. The pain in his eyes was deeper than any physical injury. The knowledge that his own blood had orchestrated his death was a wound to his soul, one that might never heal. The sophisticated plan, the complex bomb, the calculated cruelty. It all made a horrible kind of sense now. Meanwhile, Lena felt more and more like a prisoner. The safe house, provided by the police, was clean and warm, but the windows were barred and she couldn't leave. Arthur's promise of a better life now seemed like a distant, dangerous mirage. Accepting his help meant stepping into that family's world, a web of secrets and resentments that had nearly killed him. How could she live in a house bought with the money that motivated such cruelty? On the other hand, the alternative was unthinkable. Returning to the streets, her only known home, was no longer an option. She was no longer an anonymous shadow. She was a witness, a key player in their game. Her face had been shown, however briefly, on the news. People who knew her from the streets would know where to find her. Every alley that once offered refuge was now a potential trap. The situation worsened dramatically when Arthur, driven by a mix of gratitude, anger, and a desperate desire to protect her, made a well-intentioned mistake. From his hospital bed, he called a press conference. In a firm voice, he publicly thanked the young and courageous Lena, describing her as a hero. And then, to the horror of the watching detectives, he announced the creation of a trust fund in her name, an initial investment of $1 million to secure her education and future. He believed that by putting her in the spotlight, he was creating a shield of notoriety around her. He thought no one would dare touch the angel of the streets. He couldn't have been more wrong. By giving Lena a name and a monetary value, he hadn't protected her. He had just dramatically enlarged the target painted on her back. For the criminal still at large, she had gone from a troublesome witness to a symbol of their failure and now the holder of a small fortune. That same night, a social worker with a kind face, one of the few people Lena had started to talk to at the shelter, came into her room. "Lena, a boy was here. Said he knew you from Washington Square. He insisted I give this to you." The woman held out a small, folded piece of paper, looking harmless. Lena's heart began to pound. None of her old acquaintances should know where she was. With trembling hands, she unfolded the note. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, but the words were crystal clear and ice cold. There were only 5, "We know who you are." Those 5 words were more terrifying than any direct threat. There were no screams, no promises of violence, just the chilling statement of fact. Her shield of anonymity was broken. "We know who you are." The phrase echoed in her mind, stripping her of all the security she thought she had. They didn't need to look for her. They had already found her. Lena crumpled the note in her hand, the paper becoming a damp ball of sweat and fear. She showed it to the social worker, whose kind face twisted with concern. The police were called. The shelter was searched, but the boy who delivered the message had vanished, an anonymous ghost in the system. Arthur Drummond's generosity, intended as a fortress, had become a trap. That $1 million announced to the world wasn't a reward, it was a sentence. The media attention, instead of protecting her, was now just a map for her hunters. In the following days, the psychological war intensified, becoming crueler and more personal. The kidnappers, led by the resentful Richard, changed tactics. They couldn't get to Lena directly, protected as she was by the police. So they targeted her only vulnerability, her past. They began to attack the fragile fabric of her old life. Leo, a boy of about 12 to whom Lena used to give part of her bread, was found crying in an alley, his shoeshine box smashed to pieces. He told the police that 2 men had approached him, asking about the famous girl, and when he refused to talk, they destroyed his only source of income. Mrs. Rosa, an elderly woman who sold flowers near the station and always had a kind word for Lena, had her stall overturned, the flowers trampled into the dirty sidewalk. The message was clear. Delivered through the suffering of innocence, her existence brought pain to those she cared about. Every piece of news that reached the shelter was like a knife in Lena's heart. She, who had always seen herself as a protector of the weaker ones in her small universe of helplessness, was now the cause of their torment. Guilt ate away at her, a slow, painful acid. The people she tried to protect, the familiar faces of a community forged in adversity, were paying the price for her courage. The internal conflict tore her in two. On one side was Arthur's promise, a future, security, the chance to finally leave the streets behind. On the other, the devastating reality that to achieve that future, she was inadvertently destroying the present of the only people who had ever been her family. She couldn't sleep, haunted by images of Leo's frightened face and Mrs. Rosa's trampled flowers. The second major turning point came insidiously. Arthur Drummond, now out of the hospital and operating from his mansion fortress, tried to use his vast power to help the collateral victims. He sent teams to fix Mrs. Rosa's stall, to buy Leo a new shoeshine box, to offer shelter and food to anyone who was intimidated. But his help, once again, had the opposite effect. Richard's men watched every move. They saw the billionaire's intervention not as an act of charity, but as confirmation. Lena cared about these people, and that made them the perfect tools for blackmail. Their next step was even crueler. They no longer used physical violence. They started spreading money. They offered life-changing sums to the homeless in exchange for information about Lena, her habits, her fears, her friends. Loyalty on the streets was a valuable commodity, but hunger and desperation were stronger currencies. Lena's community, once united by shared misery, began to fracture under the pressure of temptation and fear. The last straw was when Lena, looking out the barred window of her room, saw the same kind-faced social worker who had given her the first note, talking discreetly to a man in a luxury car across the street. The man handed her a thick envelope. The woman glanced around nervously before tucking it into her purse and hurrying back into the building. Lena's blood ran cold. The corruption had reached here, into the heart of her sanctuary. Not even the official social services were trustworthy. She was surrounded. The walls meant to protect her were closing in. The man in the car looked up, directly at her window, as if he knew she was watching. He didn't smile, didn't gesture. He just stared, his dark, empty eyes promising there was nowhere left to run. In that moment, Lena understood the terrifying truth of her situation. She couldn't trust anyone. The sight of the social worker taking the envelope shattered the last illusion of security Lena had. The shelter wasn't a refuge. It was a gilded cage where her keepers could be bought. Every friendly face now carried the shadow of suspicion. Every kind word sounded like a potential lie. Lena's isolation became absolute, a loneliness deeper and more terrifying than any cold night she had spent on the streets. She stopped talking, retreating into a shell of silence, watching everyone and everything with wary, frightened eyes. She was a rat in a maze whose walls were made of betrayal, and the scientists watching her were the same ones controlling the cheese and the shock. The only person she felt she could still trust was Arthur Drummond, but he was distant, protected in his own fortress, fighting a war with ghosts from his own family. She realized, with painful clarity, that her mere existence had become a mortal danger to anyone who tried to help her. Arthur Drummond's kindness had resulted in persecution. The loyalty of her friends on the streets had resulted in suffering. The compassion of the social worker had been twisted into corruption. She was a catalyst for misfortune, a magnet for the darkest side of human nature. This realization was an almost unbearable burden. The guilt, once an ember, was now a bonfire consuming her spirit. She wondered if it would have been better to have stayed quiet, to have disappeared on the night of the kidnapping, as her instincts had told her. Maybe Arthur would be dead, but Leo would still have his shoe-shine box, and Mrs. Rosa would still be selling her flowers. The moral equation was torturous. Was one billionaire's life worth the peace and safety of so many other helpless people? The police investigation, meanwhile, was moving at a snail's pace. Richard Drummond was the prime suspect, but he was cunning. He had covered his tracks with impressive skill, using intermediaries and fronts to execute his plan. There was no concrete proof linking him directly to the kidnapping. Only the signet ring in an old photo and logical deduction. He vehemently denied everything, posing for the media as a concerned nephew, devastated by the brutality of what had happened to his uncle. He even offered to contribute to the fund created for Lena, an act of such audacious cynicism that it left the police and Arthur stunned. He was toying with them, safe behind an army of expensive lawyers and a well-constructed web of lies. It was against this backdrop of powerlessness and despair that the third and most devastating major turning point was revealed. It came not from the police, nor from a private investigation, but from an unexpected source. One night, Arthur Drummond, unable to sleep, was going through boxes of old documents in his library, looking for anything, any forgotten detail about his brother's business dealings that might incriminate Richard. Amidst old contracts and balance sheets for defunct companies, he found a sealed envelope addressed to him in his late brother's handwriting. It was dated 10 years prior. The instruction on the front was clear: to be opened only in the event of my unexpected death or of great danger to the family. His brother had died of a sudden heart attack, deemed natural at the time. With trembling hands, Arthur opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a small storage device. The letter was a confession. His brother, Richard's father, revealed that for years he had felt marginalized in the family business. He believed that Arthur, with his gift for investment and business acumen, had usurped what was his birthright. The resentment, built up over decades, had festered into a plan. He began siphoning small amounts from company funds, creating a secret capital reserve in cryptocurrency, preparing the ground to one day stage a larger coup and seize control. He hadn't planned violence, just a hostile financial takeover. But the letter revealed the most shocking detail: his accomplice in this scheme, the person who helped him navigate the complex world of digital assets and offshore accounts, was not Richard. It was someone much closer, someone Arthur saw every day, someone he trusted implicitly, the person who managed his personal investments, who balanced his books, and who oversaw his vast estate. His longtime financial manager, a man named Alfred. Richard wasn't the mastermind. He was just an angry, impatient pawn, manipulated by a much more experienced and dangerous player. The true brain behind it all was inside his fortress. The revelation fell on Arthur Drummond with the weight of an avalanche. He reread his brother's letter, the words blurring through a haze of shock and grief. Alfred, the man who sat at his right hand in every board meeting, the friend who had advised him on investments, who had helped him build his empire, who knew every detail of his estate, every stock, every fund, every asset and liability. The guardian of his fortune was, in fact, the serpent coiled around his treasure. The kidnapping, the bomb, the terror, it had all been orchestrated not by a greedy nephew, but by a patient, meticulous traitor masquerading as his most loyal ally. Richard's resentment had merely been the spark, but Alfred had been the hand that used it to set Arthur's world on fire. He felt like a fool, a naive billionaire, blinded by trust, while the conspiracy grew right under his nose, fed by his own money. A cold, creeping fear, unlike anything he had felt in the container, began to take hold. He was in his own home, surrounded by security, but he had never felt so vulnerable. Alfred had access to everything: his accounts, his security systems, his schedule. He could be listening to his calls, monitoring his emails. Calling the police directly was an immense risk. If Alfred realized he'd been discovered, he could disappear, taking a substantial portion of his assets with him, or worse, he could have a contingency plan, something as cruel as the bomb in the warehouse. Arthur was trapped in his own mansion, a king in a castle whose keys belonged to his enemy. He needed help, but he couldn't trust anyone in his circle. Lawyers, assistants, security guards, any one of them could be in Alfred's pocket. His network of power and influence had become useless. His thoughts, in a desperate leap of logic, went to Lena, the girl who didn't belong to his world, the girl who couldn't be bought with promises of profit or dividends, the girl whose survival instincts were sharper than any risk analyst he'd ever employed. She had seen the truth when everyone else was blind. She operated outside the system, moved through the cracks that people like Alfred couldn't predict or control. She was his only hope, his one unpredictable ally in a game where all the other pieces were compromised. But how to reach her? How to contact her without Alfred knowing? He looked around the library, his brain working feverishly. He couldn't use the phone or email. He needed an analog method, something that left no digital trail. He remembered Jonas, the old gardener who had worked on the estate for over 40 years, since before Arthur had made his fortune. A simple man, loyal to the family, not the money. Arthur scribbled a hasty note on a piece of paper from his personal notepad. He folded it and tucked it inside an envelope. He summoned Jonas to his office under the pretext of discussing the planting of new roses. "Jonas," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need you to do something for me, something of the utmost importance. Take this envelope to Detective Marcus, the one handling my case. Tell him it's crucial evidence, but he is not to open it. Tell him my instructions are for him to deliver it, sealed directly into Lena's hands. No one else. Do you understand?" The old gardener, seeing the gravity in his employer's eyes, simply nodded. "Consider it done, Mr. Arthur." At the shelter, Lena was sitting on the edge of her bed, despair a physical weight on her shoulders. She had made a decision. She was going to turn herself in. She would find a way to contact those people and tell them she would do whatever they wanted, as long as they left everyone else alone. It was the only solution. Just then, the door opened. It was Detective Marcus. His expression was a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Lena, I just received the strangest thing," he said, holding an envelope. "Drummond's gardener gave it to me, insisted it was for you, only for you." He held out the envelope. With numb fingers, Lena took it. The handwriting on the front was elegant but rushed. She tore the seal. Inside, a single folded piece of paper. The message was short, almost a code, but every word hit her with the force of a lightning bolt. "The monster isn't outside the castle. He's in the throne room. I only trust you. I need your street smarts." Arthur Drummond's message was an electric shock to Lena's numbed spirit. "I only trust you. I need your street smarts." The words reversed the tide of despair that was drowning her. Suddenly, she was no longer a cornered victim, a burden to others. She was an ally, the only ally. The most powerful man in the city, surrounded by traitors, was asking for her help. The irony was immense. Her greatest disadvantage, her life on the streets, was now her greatest asset. She understood the world of shadows, the language of survival. In a way, men in suits and ties never could. The guilt and fear didn't vanish, but they were channeled into a new purpose. Passivity gave way to a cold, sharp determination. She had to act. "Detective," she said, looking up at Marcus with a new intensity in her eyes. "I need to get out of here, but no one can know, especially not anyone who works for Mr. Drummond." Marcus frowned. confusion giving way to intrigue. He saw the change in her, the spark of courage that had replaced the fear. He didn't understand the message, but he understood the urgency. "That's impossible, Lena. You're in protective custody. It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous to stay here," she countered, her voice firm. "The walls have ears, and the ears have price tags. Mr. Drummond is in danger, a danger that's coming from inside. If I stay here, I'm useless. If I get out, I can be his eyes and ears where no one expects them to be." She was thinking fast, her street instincts taking over. "You need to create a diversion. Pretend you're transferring me to another safe house. Make a scene. Use cruisers with sirens. But in the confusion, I need to slip out back into my world. It's the only place I'll be invisible to them." The plan was risky, bordering on insane, but there was an undeniable logic to it. Marcus, a veteran cop who could feel it in his gut when something was off, knew the official investigation was stalled. He'd seen the frustration in his superiors' eyes, the way the Drummonds' power and money created an impenetrable wall. Maybe the kid's unconventional approach was the only way to break through it. He made a decision that could cost him his career. "All right," he said, "I'll arrange it. You'll get your diversion." That night, the operation was set in motion. 2 squad cars pulled up to the shelter, lights flashing, creating a deliberate spectacle. Reporters who had been on watch swarmed, while everyone's attention was on a figure covered with a sheet being escorted to one of the cars. Lena, dressed in dark clothes and a baseball cap, slipped out a back door, guided by a trusted officer from Marcus's unit. In seconds, she was back on the streets, the darkness of the alley embracing her like an old friend. She was in her element. The smells, the sounds, the shadows, it was all familiar. She moved quickly, avoiding the main streets, using the shortcuts and passages that only someone who had lived there knew. Her goal was to get near the Drummond estate, but not close enough to be seen. She needed to watch, to understand the patterns, to find a weakness. She knew she couldn't just walk in. She needed a way to communicate with Arthur, to pass information without being detected. Her mind raced, connecting the dots. She remembered Jonas, the gardener. He was the bridge. She found a spot in an abandoned building that had a clear, though distant, view of the property's back gates, where the service staff came and went, and she waited. For 2 days, she watched, living off scraps she found and water from a dripping pipe. She learned the routine. She saw Alfred's sleek car arrive each morning and leave each night. She saw the security shifts change, and she saw Jonas tending to his garden with methodical dedication. On the 3rd day, she saw her chance. Jonas was working near the back fence, pruning a rose bush. Lena picked up a small rock, wrapped a note she had prepared around it. "I'm out. Meet me at the broken bench in the old park at noon," and tossed it with precision. The rock landed harmlessly in a shrub near the gardener. He looked up, startled, saw no one, and out of curiosity went to see what made the noise. He found the rock, saw the note, and with a quick look around, slipped it into his pocket. The emotional climax was approaching. Lena knew the next step was the most dangerous. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was actively hunting a monster in its own den. Armed only with her wits and the courage born of desperation, she was about to meet Arthur's ally and give him the instructions for the final trap. The midday sun cast short shadows across the derelict park. The paint on the iron bench was peeling, and one of the wooden slats was broken, just as Lena remembered. She sat, the hood of her frayed sweatshirt pulled low over her face, looking like just another homeless youth trying to find a place to rest. Anxiety was a tight knot in her stomach, but her expression was calm, neutral. She had learned long ago that on the streets, fear was a scent that attracted predators. Punctually, Jonas the gardener appeared at the park entrance. He wore his simple work clothes and carried a paper bag, as if he were just on his lunch break. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the area until they landed on Lena. Without showing any recognition, he sat on the other end of the bench. "Keeping a safe distance. Mr. Arthur said you were smart," he said in a low voice, not looking at her. "Said you'd know what to do." "He needs to create bait," Lena whispered, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "Something Alfred wants desperately, something that will make him act recklessly." Her mind, which once worried about finding the next meal, was now architecting a complex strategy. Does Mr. Drummond have a big deal about to close? A major stock sale? A high-risk investment with the potential for a huge payoff? Jonas thought for a moment. He's mentioned selling his shares in the tech company, Innovatech. It's a deal worth hundreds of millions. The final papers are being signed in 2 days. "Perfect," Lena said. "That's it. Arthur needs to make Alfred believe he's going to cut him out of the deal, that he's going to transfer the entire cash flow to a new, secret account. The greed will make him slip up." The instructions were relayed back to Arthur through Jonas. The billionaire, a master of negotiation, played the part of his life. In a phone call deliberately leaked to his secretary, who he knew was loyal to Alfred, he spoke of an asset restructuring and the creation of a new private fund in a tax haven, where the profits from the Innovatech sale would be directed. He mentioned numbers, fake passwords, and the name of a Swiss bank. The bait was taken. Alfred, monitoring Arthur's communications, heard exactly what he'd been set up to hear. The thought of hundreds of millions of dollars slipping through his fingers blinded him with greed and panic. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act before the money vanished. Meanwhile, Lena used her network on the streets, reactivating old alliances with the promise that justice was coming. Leo, with his new shoeshine box, became her eyes near Alfred's downtown offices. Mrs. Rosa, selling her flowers, watched the cars that came and went. They were an invisible intelligence network, powered by loyalty and a shared desire to see the powerful fall. It was Leo who gave the alert. He saw Alfred entering an internet cafe in a rundown part of the city, a perfect place to conduct online activities without a trace. Lena passed the information to Detective Marcus, who, working behind the scenes, secured a secret warrant. The police operation was set up, but this time they followed Lena's script, total discretion. On the night of the stock sale, Alfred, in his office at the Drummond mansion, believing he was alone and secure, initiated the transfer of funds, using the passwords and access he had accumulated over the years. He began diverting the capital from the Innovatech sale not to Arthur's account, but to his own network of crypto wallets. What he didn't know was that the police department's cybercrimes unit, tipped off by Marcus, was monitoring his every click. They let the transaction begin, gathering the irrefutable proof they needed. The moment the first $1 million was transferred, the trap snapped shut. The doors to Alfred's office swung open and Detective Marcus walked in, flanked by 2 officers. The look of utter shock and disbelief on the financial manager's face was Lena's silent victory. The capture of Richard and the other henchmen was a downstream effect, a simple matter of time, as Alfred, in exchange for a lesser sentence, gave them all up. Lena's first costly victory was watching from the shadows as the men who terrorized her were arrested. It was a relief, but also the start of a new, exhausting process, testifying, but she was no longer alone. Arthur Drummond was by her side. Her second victory came soon after. True to his word, he not only gave her a home, but created a comprehensive young witness protection program, using his capital and influence to change the system from within. The Lena program, as it became known, offered housing, education, and psychological support to vulnerable youth who cooperated with the justice system. Lena's house wasn't just a roof, it was a symbol of a new beginning, the first headquarters of a foundation that would change thousands of lives. 4 weeks after that terrible evening at the charity gala, the morning sun streamed through Lena's kitchen window, no longer a cold reminder of another night of survival, but a warm promise of a new day. The smell of fresh coffee had replaced the scent of alleyway trash. She sat at a wooden table, a history textbook open before her, trying to reclaim the years of schooling that life had stolen. The house was modest, but to her, it was a palace. The walls were solid. The roof didn't leak, and most importantly, the front door had a lock that only she could open. It was the embodiment of security, a concept she had barely dared to dream of. The transition hadn't been easy. She still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, heart racing, with the instinct to flee before remembering where she was. The scars of the past didn't vanish overnight, but they were, slowly, beginning to heal. Arthur Drummond had become a constant figure in her new life, more of a grandfather than a benefactor. He visited regularly, not with the pomp of a billionaire, but with the simplicity of a friend. They would bring pastries from the bakery and spend hours talking, not about business or investments, but about books, dreams, and the future. He had learned a devastating lesson about the nature of wealth and trust. He discovered that his immense fortune, his vast estate measured in dollars and euros, had isolated him, blinding him to the treachery growing right beside him. Lena's courage, a quality that couldn't be bought or sold on the stock exchange, had both saved and awakened him. He now saw the world through new eyes, understanding that the greatest return on investment wasn't in stocks or gold, but in people's lives. Together, they turned the tragedy into a catalyst for change. The Lena program grew every day, funded by a substantial portion of Arthur's estate. He liquidated assets, sold off some of his holdings, and redirected the cash flow from his businesses to the foundation. Lena, with her life experience, was the soul of the project. She wasn't just the poster child, she was the architect. She helped design the programs, choose the locations for new shelters, and talk to the young people who, like her, just needed a chance. She understood their fears, their mistrust, and knew how to build bridges where others only saw walls. The girl who once begged for change now helped run a multi-million-dollar foundation, proving that a person's true inheritance isn't what they accumulate, but what they give away. One day, Arthur took her back to the ballroom where it all began. It was empty and silent, the stage dark. "It was here," he said, his voice low, "that I almost lost everything. And it was here that I gained the most valuable thing in my life, a second chance and a new perspective." Lena looked at the stage, then at the service exit where she had been huddled, a hungry and frightened shadow. The distance between those 2 points felt like a lifetime. She had discovered that her keen observation and moral courage were worth infinitely more than any material wealth. The tycoon had learned that the greatest treasures are the human beings who risk everything to save a stranger. The philanthropic gala, the stage for a terrifying crime, had been transformed into ground zero for powerful social change. The story of Lena and Arthur became a legend in the city, a reminder that even from the greatest tragedies, the most beautiful transformations can be born. Lena looked at Arthur, the man she had saved and who, in turn, had saved her in so many ways. "Shall we go home?" she asked, and for the first time, the word home had a real, solid and hopeful meaning.